Hello everyone, my name is Paul and welcome back to the new news. I hope that everyone's having a fantastic day. I hope that you, your family, and your friends are safe. And if not, I do hope that you find that safety and security in the very near future. There's been a ton of stuff that's been ongoing over the last 24 hours. And of course, we've seen a lot of good stuff that happened yesterday, but unfortunately, it usually doesn't take very long before the bad stuff really starts to set in. And we see kind of a mixture of both today, especially in the country of Ukraine. But when it comes to the news, generally speaking, what happens, what makes the news, is generally not usually good things. It's usually kind of depressing stuff. It's usually a lot of stuff that in general just isn't very good. But the thing is that with this channel, we can help. We can be the news that gives back. And the way we're able to do that is actually through you guys. So if you go and you check out the video description below, you're going to see a ton of different organizations down there. We actually added 6 yesterday. Please, I implore you to go and check them out. And if you have more, please keep them coming and keep giving them to us. You can get a hold of us on Twitter. You can get a hold of us on our Discord and reach out to a staff member and let someone know. We would love to add more, and we want to be able to cover every span of the globe. With all those organizations, 80% or more of the donations that they receive go directly to their programs. That's something that we have verified for, and to ensure that they actually go to helping people instead of paying for those things like salaries and administration's costs. And this is one of the reasons that this channel is never going to be profiting off of any of this. We do not believe in profiting off of people's misery here at the New News. We are 100% dedicated to helping people throughout the world that are affected by these. So we are never doing any kind of super chats. We're never pushing any kind of merchandising. We're never going to be monetizing these videos for our gain at all. The only thing that we will ever be doing is actually ensuring that when we are able to get to that point, we'll be putting a donation onto every single stream that we do. We'll make sure that there's a donation attached to those once we get to that point. In the meantime, it's all going to be in the description. Now, as we get ready to move into the news here, please feel free to ask questions if you're joining us live today. There is a ton of stuff that I understand it can be a little bit complicated, and especially when it comes with conflicts. Not everyone obviously knows how conflicts actually work and some of the minute details of it. Please feel free to ask questions. I will answer them to the best of my ability. Give you a little background on myself if you're new here. I served as a corporal in the United States Marine Corps between 2016 and 2020. I was an 0352 anti-tank missileman, and I did 2 tours to the Middle East. My first tour was between October of 2017 and March of 2018, and I went and spent 4.5 months in the country of Syria as part of Operation Inherent Resolve and the fight against the Islamic State, where I was attached to Special Operations Forces there, including the Green Berets, SAS, Royal Marines, and French Foreign Legion. I also went during my second deployment. I was the Javelin team leader in charge of, and I was attached to Easy Company, which is for 27, which was the crisis response company out of Kuwait. This is between October of 2019 and March of 2020. I was one of the 100 Marines that responded to the Baghdad Embassy complex, where I oversaw all anti-armor operations on the Baghdad Embassy. And I also went to Saudi Arabia and trained Saudi Arabian Marines headed into Yemen. So if I am a subject matter expert in anti-armor warfare and armored doctrine, I am also a fully cross-trained rifleman, fully cross-trained machine gunner, a partially cross-trained radio operator, and a CLS or Combat Lifesaver Qualified Marine, meaning I've received medical training and can provide medical assistance. I am also trying to remain well-rounded, so I am very interested in history, geopolitics, and many other things throughout the world, archaeology, paleontology, that kind of thing. And so I try to remain very well-rounded in what's happening throughout the world and try to keep up to date, and I'm constantly trying to learn new things, but that doesn't make me an expert in any of that. So I will try to answer it, but at the end of the day, if I don't have an answer for you, I will simply say I don't, because I can't be an expert in everything. That would take many, many lifetimes. But regardless, please feel free to ask, and I will do my best. And with anything, subject matter expert or not, if something is interesting to you, you want to know more about something, there's absolutely no substitute in the world for doing research on your own. That is the most important factor when it comes to being informed and making well-informed decisions in your life, is to do that your own research. So please, even though I'm a subject matter expert, if you find something interesting about armored vehicles or whatever I am talking about, please do your own research and verify these things for yourself. Don't just listen to someone on the internet. And with that, we get ready to roll into the news. And we start off here in Ukraine, which is, of course, our special report like we do every single night. And we come into the city of Kyiv, or the capital of Ukraine. We're going to see that we have something re-added to the list. And before I do really get into Ukraine, Nuclear, one of our regulars here on the channel, he is pretty much here every single night that we are live, and he always has a nice quote from Army Commander Conscriptovich, who originally started here as Private Conscriptovich. And he has said, quote, "I have heard that the Ukrainians have a plan involving a small peninsula in the Mykolaiv Oblast. Obviously, we have dug in and hold. After all, it's Russia's forever." That's coming from Army Commander Conscriptovich. And I think that's in reference to some of the very small pockets of where there are still Russian forces there in the Mykolaiv Oblast. But we will get to that here in a few minutes. But we can see here, now that yesterday's revelations and all the successes of yesterday, which saw the entire west bank of the Dnieper River being liberated by Ukrainian forces after a Russian withdrawal, that things are already starting to change and starting to get ready to be moved back to normal. And we can see that here in Kyiv, where the Kyiv's railway at their main station there in the city, they have officially brought the itinerary for the train that runs from Kyiv down to Kherson. It is now back on the board. So that means that here very shortly, once things are safe and able to do so, and repairs have been done to allow to do so, trains will be running once again from Kyiv down to Kherson and back, and that allows for people to return to Kherson who may have fled, and it also allows for people in Kherson who want to go visit family and friends outside of that region and who they haven't seen, and many of them don't know if they're alive or dead at this point, can go and see and show, hey, look, I'm alive, I'm happy to see you, all that fun stuff. So that's going to be very good to see that connection pick back up here. And you can see that is actually setting up there. So we got a bunch of stuff happening. So you can see all these different locations that they are actually reopening as going to be ready to go. So it's very happy. Hopefully we're going to see a lot more pop back up here in the future. Unfortunately, Crimea passed away. Not the entirety of the entire Crimean Peninsula, but Krim is actually a dog. This dog was the lone survivor of his family after a Russian missile ended up hitting his house, and he was found on top of the rubble of the house, which had killed the entire family, including their other dog, both of their children, literally everyone there. And so he was the lone survivor. He was taken to the vet. Unfortunately, he was older, and he did end up passing away in the hands of veterinarians after they had rescued him. So that entire family at this point has been killed, and that is Krim. When they found him, he was blinded and deafened by the blast there in Dnipro. This is back in late September, and he was found crying on top of the rubble of what was once his home. So unfortunately, Krim has indeed passed away. When we come down here, oh, sorry. So Nuclear says, wait, you haven't heard of the Ukrainians having a separate command for the peninsula that's separated from the rest of the Mykolaiv Oblast? I know what you're talking about. So there's this little area down here that you're talking about. This is the Mykolaiv Oblast. This is technically the south of the Dnieper River, and there are Russians that are actually in here. So, yes, I know that there are troops there. But the way that you break up these formations is that there is actually a command. So for this area right here, this falls underneath the operational command south. which is the higher level command. And I don't think they're really worrying about this right here too much, because the Russians really don't have the amphibious capabilities right now to allow them to bridge this. But we move over here, regardless, into the Donetsk Oblast, where we see that over here in Kramatorsk, or over by Kramatorsk, we get our daily Donetsk update, which comes from an individual named Pavel Krylenko, who is the head of the Donetsk Regional Military Administration. He said, quote, on November the 11th, number of victims of the Russian army in Donetsk Oblast increased by 7 killed and 4 injured. And we get this from his official Twitter. And you can see he maintains an update. This comes out at 8 a.m. local time every single day, and it covers the previous 24 hours of activity. And this one came out this morning, and he maintains this nice little graphic for us. And he says, according to this, and according to him and his administration, not including areas that have been occupied, such as Volnovakha, Mariupol, and many other places within the Donetsk Oblast, from the start of the Russian invasion on February the 24th until now, 1,200 civilians have been killed and 2,587 have been injured so far in the Donetsk Oblast alone. And the Donetsk Oblast, that makes sense. Those numbers make sense, especially when you consider just the sheer amount of special brutality and bitter fighting that is ongoing within this region. The Donetsk Oblast sees this area has been in constant fighting for some time now. Has been in constant fighting really for the past 8 years. And we see very, very heavy static defensive lines within this region on both sides. Both Russian and Ukrainians are in very, very well in place static defensive trench lines, and that make it very difficult for maneuver warfare. And as a result, you see a high, and especially high concentration of artillery usage within these areas, because there really isn't any way to cross no man's land with any successful results of maneuver warfare. So it's relied mostly on World War I style tactics within this region. Not necessarily the wave assaults, though we do see the Russians doing that in platoon and company size elements. But we mostly see artillery usage. I mean, we've seen so much artillery usage that a lot of parts of Ukraine, especially in the Kiev Oblast, in the Kharkiv Oblast, in the Kherson Oblast here, in the Donetsk and Luhansk and Zaporizhia Oblasts, we see entire areas of land that much more resemble the battlefields of the Somme after millions of artillery shells have been fired, much more than they actually resemble a 21st century modern battlefield. This has really moved into this is a war of attrition. Both sides are whittling down their opponent and their opponent's nerves and exploiting any gaps that they can find with little times that they have the ability to find them. But this is much more World War I style warfare. It would appear that war is actually increased to the point, or that has gone to the point in many cases where it is so deadly now, it is so impossible, it makes it very difficult for this maneuver warfare to take place, and therefore you get the same kind of mentality of, well, if we can't outmaneuver them because warfare is now so deadly, that there's very little chance of success in the open, then you see them digging those trench lines. And that's the same mentality with how the machine gun came about, and many of the much more accurate artillery pieces and the technology that come out by the time that World War I actually carries out. And that's the end of the cavalry charge. That's the end of colorful uniforms to be able to identify each other on the battlefield. Technology has just progressed way much further than they had anticipated, and the tactics of the time, of the era that had been taught and was thought to work, simply didn't work in reality. It was an on-paper thing, and we're kind of seeing that now, and we're seeing how they're trying to work that out. And one of the things is heavy usage of drones and quadcopters for spotting artillery and to allow much better precision with their weapon systems. So Delta Aviation 23 says, asked, are Harpoon and Neptune missiles reachable from Kherson to Sevastopol, Crimea, in order to target the Black Sea Fleet? That's a really good question, and I honestly don't know, because I don't know much about anti-ship missiles. I started in the Marine Corps, so I really didn't have to deal with anti-ship missiles. What we do know is, in the same kind of context, is now that the Kherson region on the western side of the Dnipro River has been liberated, that puts HIMARS well within range to start hitting places like Chaplinka, which is over here. We do know that there is a helicopter base that had been built around Chaplinka, so that most of the helicopters that were at the Kherson International Airport could actually be brought down into Crimea and further away from the fighting. And now those are back within range. I do not know with the weapon systems that Ukraine has at hand and the types of munitions, because we hear about the HIMARS missiles, but we don't hear specifically what types of HIMARS missiles they are receiving, other than we know that they're not receiving the ATACMS, which is the very long range version of the HIMARS missile. So I do not know exactly what range, what is it within range. I can assume at this point, considering what we have seen before, that parts of northern Crimea are within range of the HIMARS. But as for Neptune missiles and the like, anti-ship missiles, I do not believe that there's really any point here in which Sevastopol is actually within range of those Neptune missiles. They hit. My understanding is that from Odessa, they can hit right about the center. They hit about right between Sevastopol and Odessa is pretty much where these missiles cap off at their maximum range. So that's my understanding of it. But I'm not a professional on that, and I just don't know. But that does make sense considering where we see the Moscow being sunk. We see a lot of the anti-ship missile employment happening when they're within this area, which is why the Black Sea Fleet has allowed them to, or why the Black Sea Fleet is really sticking to just around this Sevastopol area. We continue over into Bakhmut, where Bakhmut is seeing quite a significant amount of heavy fighting still. We're still seeing mostly, once again, heavy artillery usage. And this is by both sides. The Russians definitely more so with indiscriminate fires. The Ukrainians are relying heavily on precision fires for their effectiveness because they have to make up for a lack of quantity. And this is something that all NATO nations have an issue with. So this isn't just pertaining to Ukraine and its capabilities, but many countries' capabilities, especially within the NATO alliance. Those NATO artillery guns that they receive, the M777, the Caesar artillery, the PHC-2000, the M109A3 Paladin, those systems are amazing. They're 155 millimeter NATO artillery guns. They are much, much more accurate than Russian guns, especially when they're employed correctly. And they have a longer range. Depending on the munition type, a standard high explosive munition for any of the 155 millimeter guns actually outranges the standard artillery gun, which is the 152 millimeter self-propelled gun used by the Russians. Or they also have 152 millimeter towed artillery, but that's beside the point. But that outranges the Russians by about 5 kilometers, if not more, depending on the munition type. And that's the 5 kilometers at low end is the high explosive round, according to public release information. That is, of course, usually that's lower than what the actual capability of the system is. But we see that, but there's a lack of them. There's a lack of these M777 artillery guns, and there's just so few of them that they have to do what's called basically they shoot and scoot. And they are basically running around and they're constantly displacing, setting up artillery, and they're dropping high precision artillery rounds on targets, such as the Excalibur round. And they're hitting Russian targets, and they're moving and they're hitting Russian targets again. But they don't have the massive amount of artillery that has that kind of range to both provide heavy artillery fires, accurate artillery fires, and also amass large volumes of artillery fire at the same time. It's one or the other. You're either hitting targets, or you're either hitting targets with extremely accurate but short shoots, or you're massing large amounts of artillery and you're bombarding a location. The Russians opt for the latter, while the Ukrainians opt for accuracy. So we see that here in the area of Bakhmut, where indiscriminate shelling has just completely destroyed the city. I mean, it is destroyed. It will have to be rebuilt. It's a smaller microcosm similar to that of Mariupol. It is just absolutely leveled. And we see that with many, many towns and villages, many of which we don't even see by name, are just completely leveled with this mentality of Russian artillery usage of just indiscriminate massed volume artillery fire, or what we would consider saturation bombardment, which is also, if when you hear saturation bombardment, think carpet bombing, or think of the massive amount of bombardments, the massive flights of B-17s during World War II, flying over flying over German cities and dropping their payloads. That's the same mentality. That's the same results. It's just with rocket artillery most of the time, and we can see that here. And this type of fighting, this type of warfare, drastically impacts the civilians more than it actually impacts the battle space itself. So, because the reality of this type of warfare is it's not very effective. Precision artillery fire is the way to go, because it means that you're hitting targets. You're hitting military targets of value, whether that be artillery guns, command centers, ammunition depots. But saturation bombardment, basically scorched earth policy, like we see on the part of the Russians, is bombarding strategic, quote unquote. Bakhmut was strategic, it no longer is. Locations with massive amounts of artillery, and it means that while yes, you will eventually hit something with it, generally speaking, the majority of your artillery rounds aren't actually doing damage to their target. They are exploding around the target, they're exploding in the city, and it's mostly affecting civilians. It's not really affecting it's not really affecting your enemy and having any real change on the battlefield other than suppression, suppressive fires. And it doesn't make a huge impact on on your enemy's capability to wage war. And that's one of the detriments, is once again, it disproportionately affects the civilian population. And it's also a war crime to indiscriminately bomb a city. And when you do it systematically, like we have, and that's according to the 1949 Geneva Conventions, and also Protocol 1, additional Protocol 1 of the Geneva Conventions, which was adopted in 1977. So that is why it's a war crime, and to do it systematically, and to do it continually in multiple locations, as we've seen with Mariupol, Lysychansk, Mykolaiv, and many, many others. That is actually considered under the 1993 Rome Statute to be a crime against humanity, because it happened once or whatever. It's continually happening. It's systematic, and it's systematic, indiscriminate attacks against people. Come down here. This is over in the village of Olin, which is here in the Donetsk Oblast. It's just to the north of the city of Donetsk, and Russian forces ended up entering. In Apitin, and we see that the Russian forces did enter into this. It was actually reported by RIA Novosti, but it was actually geolocated to this location. So we do know that Russian forces are in this village. We do not believe that it has, or we haven't seen evidence that it has fallen to Russian forces at this point. Our understanding is that this village is still considered to be contested by Ukrainian and Russian forces until we can otherwise identify that. But we do know, we do see drone footage of them having entered the village. And so we can see that here. Russian forces very clearly bringing out the Russian flag as they enter into this village. So we do know for a fact that this area is now considered to be contested. Now, this is also a village which has been really, really badly hurt by the war prior to this. A lot of that destruction isn't coming from here, as you can see. This is satellite footage, and this satellite footage coming from, this is Google Maps. This is Google My Maps specifically is what I use for this. And the areas around here are shown as they were prior to the prior to the invasion here this February. So the destruction you see on these on this imagery is from the infighting inside of Ukraine by Russian-backed separatists and by Ukrainian forces prior to the invasion. So the prior 8 years of destruction. You can see the toll it's already taken. You see these warehouses which have been hit with artillery and destroyed and are in complete disrepair. You see the same thing with many of these houses that are that are damaged. You even see some that are destroyed, as that one there. Complete roof has caved in. You see damage to these buildings as well. And of course, some of this can also be neglect too, but we do see this makes sense considering where it's located at. It's located near here, which is the Donetsk Donetsk International Airport, and we can see the destruction of the war prior here as well. And we do know that there are areas around here where civilians have been hit. You can take a look at right here. This is a small civilian neighborhood. It was directly adjacent. It was also entirely destroyed, essentially. We also see over here in these neighborhoods where we see, where houses have been hit, but we also see where houses, are no longer being hit or destroyed. The further and further you actually get away from the airport, which tells us that the Ukrainian forces, when hitting this region, were actually minimizing their artillery. Their artillery strikes are actually trying to keep it within the general area of actually trying to minimize collateral damage, essentially. Which, with their weapon system at the time, they were using the same stuff, BM-21 Grads, D-30s, the mostly prior Soviet-era equipment. So it does make sense that there would be some spread there, and it definitely does cause some collateral, but it is minimized. We see that here as well, and many, many other villages have the same effects. You can see destruction in most of them from the prior 8 years of war. Now we see, we have a couple of questions I think that have come in here. It totally fell to Russian forces, Army Commander Conscriptovich. We're still getting Conscriptovich quotes. Don't think Ukraine nor the Ukrainians will ever be the same again. How can you put your life back together? See this war and living inside it. How can we do this to each other still? And that's coming from Barbara Christina. Great to see you back here, Barbara. It's always happy to see you. Well, war is part of being a human being. As much as I hate to say it, it's part of being human. See, millions, I'd say millions of years ago, when human beings first, when human beings, Homo sapiens, as a species arose, back, modern humans arose about 200 to 250,000 years ago. But when the first modern humans, Homo sapiens, actually arose, there were about 5 other species, or between 4 and 5 other species of hominids that were also on the earth. And one of those included the Neanderthals. As most people can easily recollect them. I believe Homo erectus, I can't remember if Homo erectus was still around or if it had just died off after surviving several million years on the planet. The fact of the matter is that not only did we as humans outcompete for resources and just were better in many ways through evolution, we're just better in many ways, better brain capacity to take in information, stronger, faster, capable of more intellectual thoughts and pre-planning for things, and preparing, better communication skills just by the way that our vocal cords and our jaws are set up, and how we are able to make a multitude of other sounds that other species just simply could not. So it improves our communication capabilities. with each other, and the ability to and just a better ability, both with brain and physical capability of giving each other, of exchanging ideas and thoughts and in putting it into words. So that started to kill off the other hominid species. However, evidence that archaeologists and paleontologists are finding now, with what very little that they have, is showing that, or starting to show that it wasn't just out competition, out competing these other hominid species, but actually it's most likely occurred that when groups of Homo sapiens ran into groups of Neanderthals, while there was some intermarriage essentially between the two species, that for the most part, us with other hominid species were actually very hostile. And we actually essentially committed genocide against every other species of hominid on the planet, to include the Neanderthals and other species. So it's something that is ingrained into us as a species, is instinctual because of our capability, because of our thought process regarding competition, our natural instincts regarding competition for survival and resources. And this is something that goes into, this can start really getting into a lot of philosophy and morality and everything else, but regardless of how you look at it, human history is plagued with violence and thought process, and that thought process based off of competition for resource and competition for land and that sort of thing. And it's one of the reasons that make us very progressive as a society, allowing us as a species to progress and create and make technologies to improve, that end up improving our societies as a whole. But it also leads to other things that allow us to destroy each other, like nuclear weapons, and it causes things like this with war for essentially no reasons, no good reason behind it. So that's just kind of the take on it. That is how we are still able to do this. And then, for as terrible as war is, it does happen. And a lot of people, and this is my personal opinion, a lot of people in the world, and a lot of activists and a lot of people in society, once again, my personal opinion, they look at idealism. It's very idealistic. And they want, ideally, you don't want nuclear weapons. Ideally, you don't want warfare. Ideally, you don't want genocide. You don't want world hunger. Ideally, you don't want, conflicts and whatever else. You want education. You want equal value. You want equal rights for everybody. You want all of this stuff. And a lot of people, talk about, well, we should stop funding, the military, or we should stop sending money to this, so we can take care of our own issues for this kind of stuff. And the fact is that we don't live in a world of ideals. We live in a world of realities. And the reality is that war happens, and that genocide happens, and that people are mistreated, and that racism still exists, and that people's freedoms are taken away, and that genocide is ongoing against a multitude of people, ethnic cleansing and many other things. That radical idealism, radical ideologies exist for everybody, regardless of religion, regardless of race or ethnicity, rather. That there are extremist ideologies in all groups, and that is the reality. That if you are trying to focus on the idealistic principles, it's good to reach for the stars and go for idealistic things. But that should be something that you should be thinking about for your children and your grandchildren. But you should deal with the realities now as they are, and should be fighting you should be supporting a fight for right to self-determination, sovereignty, and also to end genocide, so that way your children don't have to deal with it in the future, because you already have. You should be fighting and supporting groups that are, you should be fighting racism. You should be fighting anti-Semitism. You should be fighting things like, against these kind of ideologies to be able to, so that way your children and your grandchildren don't have to. They just have to maintain what you've already gained. And unfortunately, freedom isn't something that is just bought and paid for. It's something that you must maintain. And that is why armies have to exist, and why we have to do some of the things we do. And unfortunately, there are still always going to be bad eggs, no matter who you look at. So that's my personal. That's my personal opinion. Once again, I don't believe in idealistic principles. I believe in dealing with I believe that idealistic principles and striving to them and thinking of them, and believing in a moral high ground don't really help a situation. I think they actually hinder it. And so I believe that we need to face the realities of the world, which many people seem to not really want to do. They want to live in the world now that they believe in. They don't want to actually fight for the world that they believe in, to create the world. They just want it to exist. Let's see here. Seeing a lot of people jumping in here. Good to see. Hello. Did I see the air show? Yes, we will get to that towards the end of the stream. We do have the video footage from that. Small Eastern country, they have pride in the country, rebuilding and attractive businesses and tourists. That won't be easy though. I'm just making sure I don't have any more questions coming in here. All right, cool. So we come down here, and this is in Marinka, where we see fighting is continuing in the city of Marinka. And Marinka is down here. This is what basically, I wouldn't quite call it a suburb. It's not quite close enough to be considered a suburb, Donetsk, but it's definitely pretty close. And these areas right here are putting pressure onto the city of Donetsk itself, which is in Russian control. And this is a major headquarters, supply area, logistical headquarters for the Russian forces within this region. And so they're constantly trying to put pressure onto the Ukrainians and push them away from the city to relieve some of the pressure on their logistical supply lines and the danger that is posed to them as much as possible. So it's a constant fight, and that's really what we're ended up seeing over here in Marinka, which is down here to the south of Donetsk, where brutal fighting is picking up. And once again, the Donetsk region is seeing some of the most brutal fighting we've seen the entire war. So unfortunately, this does have some copyright music, but we're coming in here. You can see just the amount of destruction. Once again, these artillery bombardments, these indiscriminate artillery bombardments on these locations. And winter is setting in, by the way. So this is going to make it much more difficult for both sides as this war progresses, as the winter starts to set in. Just the conditions that you're fighting in make it very difficult to morale drops, generally speaking. Life sucks. No one likes being extremely cold or wet or miserable, regardless of who you are. And it makes it much more difficult to maneuver, and it just you generally speaking lose momentum in the wintertime. In fact, in the Middle East, even though the weather conditions are usually generally better there for fighting, even in the wintertime for many groups, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, is the Islamic State, while they do continue small military actions throughout the winter, they actually have fighting seasons. So the wintertime is a downtime for them, and then the summertime is actually their fighting season. That's where you see a lot of activity really pick up, like we did when we were seeing, when we first started this channel back in March. We had some activity, and then we see that there's a lot of activity there in the summertime, and then now you're starting to see it wind down once again as the fall and winter really start coming in. This is over here in Pavlivka. Once again, this does have more copyright music, but we saw that the formation, the Omega unit here in Pavlivka actually destroyed. It's a textbook. It's an absolute textbook attack on a armored convoy using anti-tank guided missile systems. It's that textbook ambush on a convoy. And we see that this is an entire Russian convoy that has been completely destroyed in the vicinity of Pavlivka here in the Donetsk Oblast by these Ukrainian troops. So, as you can see here, an entire convoy, you can see mostly BMPs. These are mostly BMP systems here. It's very difficult to identify what type of BMPs, but I can identify them as BMPs that are rolling down here. And you got some tanks with them. And you see that was a lead tank. And the lead tank, they pick it off first. And the reason you do that is it halts the convoy. And so, generally speaking, the basic way to hit a convoy is you hit the first tank, you hit the first armored vehicle, or the first vehicle in the convoy, it stops the convoy. Then you hit the last vehicle in the convoy, and it keeps them from being able to back up. And then you want to identify any of the, if there's a lot of antennas on a vehicle or something, that's usually the command vehicle, and you engage the command vehicle, and that destroys their leadership capability. And that really causes, on top of the fact they're already in an ambush, that causes a lot of difficulty in them being able to, it causes a lot of chaos basically in their formation. And then you want to destroy any recovery vehicles that they have that prevents them from recovering any of these downed vehicles. And then you just start picking off vehicles in between. So I normally, if there aren't any specialized vehicles inside of a convoy, my method of attack is usually first vehicle, last vehicle, and then I hit the center vehicle. And then I just pick off every other vehicle, and then I work my way back up. So I just go from left to right, pick off every other vehicle in the convoy, and then I work my way back up right to left once I get to the end of the convoy, if I'm engaging a long line like this. So that's kind of my methodology behind it. But you can see they wipe out this convoy. Like, they just wipe it out. So it's a textbook ambush on an armored convoy, and that essentially destroys, I wouldn't say an entire BTG, but a good portion of a battalion tactical group's armored capabilities. Which, when you look at Russia, they don't maintain any light infantry battalions. They're completely motorized and mechanized, meaning when you're talking about annihilating the majority of a BTG's armored capabilities, you're really talking about the annihilation of the BTG itself. So instantly, this unit has been completely rendered combat ineffective. They neutered this unit in a single engagement. So that's really the kind of warfare that we're looking at. And this is why you don't fight armored convoys, and you don't use armored convoys and armored vehicles unsupported by infantry assets. Because it leaves them very exposed, and it means that it's very easy to be ambushed like this. Now, this one in particular is not, I wouldn't say it's necessarily completely the case of they didn't have any infantry support, because this happens to anybody. This kind of style of attack really isn't something you can stop, but it definitely is something that you don't want to be just rolling full speed ahead in enemy territory. You should have dismounts and stuff that are pushing up, especially if you're getting into an area where you believe it might be a danger zone. And warfare is, generally speaking, very boring and very slow. But it's that way for a reason, because it minimizes losses. As many people have heard, especially if they're very tactical, slow is smooth and smooth is fast. Arch Instinct says, I wonder if that was the armored vehicles that was brought up to reinforce the Donbass last week. I mean, partially, probably. It's very difficult to tell. We just don't know. It's very difficult to tell exactly what units are where and who is operating and what losses each unit has actually sustained. Just because of a lot of the operational security situation here. What we can assume is that, or what we're really seeing, and we can assume, is that these armored vehicles, generally speaking, or that these units, generally speaking, are not being rotated off of the front lines. And as a result, they are becoming more and more combat ineffective as the day goes on, and as the fighting goes on. And so they're not making an impact on the battle space as a result. They're just continually suffering losses. And they're not being reinforced with new amounts of manpower. So eventually these BTGs are just completely becoming wiped out. And the only thing that they're getting resupplied is vehicles, material. But even then, they're becoming more and more obsolete material that they're being reinforced with. So they're going from T90s to T80s to T72s to T62s very, very quickly. And most of the equipment that they use anyway is a lot of BMPs. And in some cases, we've seen those actually being swapped out for BMDs, which is basically the paratrooper version of the BMP, but it's even thinner on its armor, and it's much smaller, and it's much less capable. Arch Instinct says if those were T-80s and some BMPs and recovery vehicles. They didn't have any recovery vehicles in that convoy. It was all combat vehicles, as much as I could tell. While the Russians carry on towards the tank that is hit, surely could affect. Well, that actually makes... So, yeah, that's actually a really good point. And there's actually a reason behind that. So, Barbara Christina says, why do the Russians carry on towards the tank that is hit? Surely they know it could affect their tank too, as in this clip. Is that poor command? No. So, whenever you're actually attacked in an ambush, especially a close-in ambush, what you do is you actually fight through the ambush. That's actually the best thing to do. And that's something that we actually train to do. So, if, say you're getting ambushed from the flank, because it looks like this was actually an L-shaped ambush, because if you saw those BMPs and BMDs were actually engaging targets to their direct front while they were becoming engaged from the ATGMs from the side, which is very smart on the Ukrainians' part to have an L-shaped ambush because it keeps your focus on the enemy towards the front, and your ATGMs have the largest, they have the best possibility of a hit ratio because they are presented to the largest target, which is the broadside of the vehicle. Very, very intelligent thing to do. Very, very well established ambush. Obviously also appears to be firing from a tree line with cover and concealment. But with an ambush, what you do is you actually turn to actually face the enemy, and you actually assault to the enemy. So you push through the ambush by assaulting towards them. You actually go on the offensive, and that's actually the better thing to do in an ambush. It minimizes your losses, and it also destroys the enemy's capability to fight later on. So it's actually a twofold thing. And it's also not something that most people are that's not something that most people, when they establish an ambush, are actually preparing for. They're expecting that when they hit their ambush, the expectation is that it's going to cause a lot of chaos. You're going to have some retreating. You're going to have dudes trying to figure out what to do and firing in all different directions. And it's just not going to be a good defensive line. But if you have everyone actually pivot and actually assault through to the ambush, it actually throws off your opponent's initiative, and they have to now displace, and they're now disorganizing their own forces, and it can cause a very bad situation for them. So, but an L-shaped ambush actually kind of prevents that because you have mutual supporting fires, which appears to be what the Ukrainians do, and you're also fixing the attention of the assaulting force on a certain location. So it prevents them, and it splits their attention. Even if they do realize that they're caught in an L-shaped ambush, it actually splits their attention and their focus, which makes them easy targets because they can't. You can't establish a base of fire very easily if you do that, and you can't. Which means you can't set up where you're gonna where the majority of your fire is, the suppression, and then you can't maneuver forces around it. And it also makes it very difficult for them to I guess retreated in a hurry. Yeah, not really. They got annihilated, but you can't concentrate your fire either because you're split, and so you don't get fire superiority. And you want fire superiority at the outset of an engagement, which is why you do something called RTR, return fire, take cover, return accurate fire. Basically, the methodology is on your rifle. Is you basically, if you were ambushed, you would turn towards where you're taking fire from. You would throw your rifle on burst. You would dump a mag in burst fire, as well as everyone else in the platoon, and you would drop down, you'd find some cover, and you'd throw another mag in, and then you switch it back to semi-automatic, and you start actually aiming at an individual and taking fire, and actually engaging your targets to actually hit them and kill them. But firing establishing that base of fire, that fire superiority, really allows them to, really basically puts their head down because they become suppressed. And so they're not going to want to poke their heads up and shoot because there's a lot of bullets coming their way all at once. For the 240, we used to carry a contact belt, which is a very short belt. It's about 50 rounds, and you just literally wrap it around the gun. And then if you get engaged, you drop down on the bipod, and you just dump the entire 50 rounds out of that 240 into the general vicinity of where that fire is coming from, and then you reload and you can start actually providing accurate suppression with a 240 machine gun. That's actually something you can do too. But yeah, that's the general idea. But that's why you assault through an ambush, as well as a bunch of other stuff that wasn't asked. So, Paul, I know the next place Ukraine should liberate. It's a nice little fortified village called Moscow. No, I do not think that's a great idea, personally. As much as fun as it would be, and I do believe Moscow should burn, but I don't believe that is a smart military decision. T-34s when? We've seen T-34s. Just one at a roadblock in Lysychansk. So we have seen T-34s. Most of the T-34s are actually still could just use a little bit of maintenance and could run again, believe it or not. And they have a lot of them. I mean, they build a stupid amount of T-34s. Ukraine has them all over the place because Ukraine built the T-34s. They were the main manufacturer. It was actually a Ukrainian tank company that actually built the majority of T-34s in service, including all variants of the T-34 and also the T-34-85 with the up armored gun or with the up gun. So they have them everywhere. But wouldn't be surprised if they did actually bring in T-34s in like a combat capability. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the Russians, in case anyone's wondering, like, do they even have the munitions for the main gun on the T-34? When the Soviet Union collapsed, the Russian Federation, one of the first things they did is they went through their stockpiles that they still had in Russia, and they had artillery munition that was stockpiled from before World War I in the late 1800s that they didn't even have the artillery guns for anymore. They still had the ammunition for them though, in storage. So I would not be surprised if they still actually have the capability of employing a T-34 for real. Not that it would be good, but the T-34 probably wouldn't work out too bad as a light infantry support vehicle right now. I mean, it's still a good... I mean, T-34s have been used clear up until now. I mean, we saw... my understanding is there was even T-34s in Afghanistan. And many countries actually still keep them. A lot of poorer countries, but a lot of countries actually still keep them in reserve. So they still have T-34s, but they're on reserve status. But they can still be reactivated and used. In fact, I think Paraguay has, can't remember, I think it's the M3 Stuart that they have still. And I think they have some M24 Chaffies too. So, and then World War II equipment is popping up in Syria all the time. Anyway, this is a video. This is coming from Moise Bondarenko, and we've seen a lot of musicians. This is kind of a morale boosting thing here, but they're conducting a performance to boost some morale and kind of get some R&R here while on the front lines. Here, somewhere along the front lines here. Take a look. Very, very nice. Sorry, my cat decided it wanted to go nuts, so I apologize if there's some weird background noises that are about to happen. So we see that Russian troops have arrived in Mariupol. More Russian forces are arriving in the city of Mariupol following the fact that they are retreating out of the Kherson Oblast. Residents are saying that there are a lot more troops than there usually is there now. We can see some of those vehicles pulling in. And so this is an indicator that Russian forces, they're reconcentrating troops now. And we'll get to a little bit more of that here. But right now, the Russian forces have withdrawn from the Kherson area. And they're now onto the eastern bank of the Dnieper River. And what they're now doing is for the most part, neither side has to now actually put a lot of troops along this front line, because crossing the Dnieper River is exceptionally difficult. If in the crossings, the main crossings that allow for that type of operation to happen are destroyed, so there is no real way to get across the Dnieper River, and nor does either side really want to. At this point, they don't have really the troops on the Russian part, and the Ukrainian part really they don't need to. So both sides are putting a minimal amount of defensive troops in this region just to hold it down and prevent the other side from creating incursions against each other. That's really what we are going to expect here. Now, with this area being secure, the Russian forces now having withdrawn and being pretty solidly putting a defensive line up in here, or we're seeing them where they're taking all of those troops that were in the Kherson region, and they're having now been pulled out. They're pulling them back, and they're going to take them to places like Melitopol and Mariupol and Enerhodar and other locations throughout this region, throughout the rest of the occupied areas. And what they're going to do is they're going to take them. They're going to move them there for a short period of time, and it's mostly places that are. It's mostly places that they have a lot of logistical capabilities for. And this allows them to regroup these forces, and if they have like 2 BTGs that are at half strength, they put them together and they make one. And then they give them more ammunition, more supplies if they have it available, and then they push these units to the front lines up here in places like the Donetsk Oblast, where they're seeing heavy casualties on both sides, very brutal fighting. They're reconcentrating their forces. Ukraine is doing the same thing. It's just that Ukraine's much better at operational security about this, and we're not going to show that here anyway. And they're going to move their forces and reconcentrate them in places where they're needed more now too. So both sides are doing this. Both sides are simultaneously doing this. The victory is won here, and now they're pushing over here to reconcentrating forces in other locations. Delta Aviation's 23 says 10,000 troops are reportedly still trapped on the right side of the Dnieper River. That is correct. So up to 10,000 Russian forces are trapped. Many of them are either waiting to surrender, or they have changed into civilian clothes and are trying to escape or evade Ukrainian forces at this point in time, which is something that we've seen happen before, but that is true. The last bit of, especially the last 48 hours of the withdrawal out of the Kherson region for the Russians was extremely messy, and it left many men and a lot of equipment behind. Bookham 40 says Ukraine has shown no signs of doing a stalemate over winter. I'm hearing they've crossed into the peninsula south of Kherson. Yes and no. It's possible, and my understanding is that there is some limited incursion, but it's the same reason the Russians had to withdraw is the same reason the Ukrainians don't need to push into the south of the peninsula. And it's because logistics is a logistical nightmare. With the Antonovsky Bridge and Novokakhovka over here, the Novokakhovka Dam, with those being destroyed, there really isn't any way to move a large amount of troops and materials into the south of the region. So troops that you send across that river, unless you establish air superiority to allow for aircraft, helicopters to come in and bring in massive amounts of supplies, or unless you bridge over them with bridging equipment and are able to protect it successfully from being destroyed, or unless you have a large quantity of boats that you can use to cross, there isn't a logistical way to sustain a large offensive across the Dnipro River for any large force of troops. It's very risky. It's not that it couldn't be done. It's the fact that it's extremely difficult and extremely risky. In my personal opinion, not being the one who knows anything about this, right? Like, I don't know the exact situation on the ground. But from what I can tell and what I can see is Ukraine doesn't have that capability, as we've seen with over by Lysychansk and Severodonetsk. Because Lysychansk, Severodonetsk are separated by the Siversky Donetsk River, and one of the reasons Severodonetsk fell is because the bridges across the Siversky Donetsk River have been blown, and they're using boats and trying to get supplies across and getting the wounded out and getting reinforcements in there, but they couldn't move a lot of heavy equipment across the river, and as a result they couldn't keep up the fight for Severodonetsk and had to withdraw simply because it wasn't logistically viable. Which tells me that Ukraine really doesn't. This is a much smaller river than the Dnipro is. So it makes it so we know that there's already difficulty for Ukraine to do that with a smaller river, let alone the Dnipro River. And from a tactical sense, it doesn't make a lot of sense to do that for a sustained campaign. Because once again, logistically, it's just not smart. It's not intelligent. It would be very difficult, very risky. That doesn't mean they can't do it. Doesn't mean there wouldn't be successes if they did do it. Because I'm not going to say the Ukrainians can't do something, because they've proven time and time again that they certainly can. They certainly can do things that we thought were impossible, like winning this war. Because at the beginning of this war, they statistically, on paper, they should not have been able to do it. Ukraine should have fell on paper within 72 hours. But the reality is that we are, that was 72 hours 262 days ago. So I'm not going to say they can't, but I'm also not going to say that they can, just because of the situation on the ground. I don't think allows for it. And Sci-Fi says Russia has the same problem, hence lost Kherson. Exactly. The same thing that causes the victory of Kherson for the Ukrainians is also the same thing that keeps them from continuing successfully in Kherson. The thing that allowed for victory in Kherson was the Dnipro River and cutting off the Russians and basically encircling them by cutting off their supply lines across the Dnipro River. If Russia is to continue that campaign into the other side of the Dnipro River, they have now essentially encircled themselves on the opposite bank of the Dnipro, and the same thing that allowed them to win would cause them significant difficulty to continue that campaign in that style. Logistically speaking, amphibious operations, which is what that would have to be considered. Amphibious operations are the most logistically difficult and dangerous and most desperate offensive measures of warfare. Conducting an amphibious assault against a defended beachhead is the most desperate thing in warfare. There is no harder task in war than assaulting a fortified beachhead against a well-dug-in and defensive enemy in an amphibious assault. It is a desperate move. And logistically, it's extremely, extremely difficult. Delta Aviation 23 asks, does Moscow still consider Kherson part of Russia? Yes, they formally annexed them. Yeah, 92% of people voted in Kherson to join the Russian Federation. Yeah, okay. But Russian forces are digging in, and we do see them doing that here. So this is some video footage. This is from the other side of the Dnieper River. This is the eastern side of the Dnieper River. Russian forces are already bringing in equipment and starting to dig in for a defensive line. Arch Instinct says lots of dragon's teeth and coat boxes on the Russian defense. And then Barbara Christina asks, "Is this Crimea?" No, this is not Crimea. This is the south. This is over here. This is this bank of the Dnieper River. This is the east bank. So dragon's teeth. Dragon's teeth are an anti-tank emplacement. It's a concrete pyramid essentially. Now they don't use them properly. This is kind of an ad hoc version of the dragon's teeth. Dragon's teeth have to be anchored into a concrete slab underneath wherever you're employing them. That being said, they can be effective, but they're not nearly as effective in this regard. But it still can create very formidable looking defensive positions. And sometimes in the military, one of the things that I was always told is perception is reality. If you look like you know what the hell you're doing and you're confident about what the hell you're doing, even if you don't know what you're doing, people are going to think you do. And same thing with a lot of things. You don't that translates into a lot of things. You don't, when you're out and about in on a convoy, for instance, everyone picks up their different positions on the machine guns, right? Like you have something like your lead vehicle is taking up 12 o'clock, rear vehicle is picking up at 6. Second vehicle is picking up 3 o'clock, third vehicle is picking up 9 o'clock, right? But everyone's turrets should constantly be moving. You shouldn't just have them fixed at the 12, fixed at the 3, fixed at the 9, fixed at the 6. You should be constantly looking, because it makes it look like you're looking, or even if you're not really doing so, even though you definitely should be in a combat zone, it gives the indicator that to the enemy, the visual indicator that you are looking and searching. Whereas if the vehicles that are just fixed in one place, like the gun is just fixed at 12 and not sweeping from like 11 to 1, right? It makes them think, right? It makes it think that you're not really looking, you're not really paying attention, you're just looking at whatever direction you're supposed to look, and you're not really scanning around for them. So that's the perception is reality kind of thing, and that can be done with a defensive line too. Defensive line's perception can definitely be it can definitely turn into reality of, this looks like it's a very difficult defensive position and it would be very bad to assault, so we probably shouldn't assault it. And it then works in that way. And the cope boxes that he's talking about they're concrete pill boxes that the Russians have used. They're pre-manufactured pill boxes. They can be effective if properly employed, and that's just like one-man pillboxes. But anything, I mean, for a rapid defense, like what they're trying to build, I mean, that's much better than a defensive position that I would have built and that I have built, right? Like they're using legitimate concrete barriers and stuff in concrete pillboxes. Like we used HESCO barriers. Like we used canvas blocks filled with sand and dirt. I mean, it worked really well, but I mean that's the thing, right? So that's kind of what I think they're going for. It's not necessarily effective, but perception can be reality. And something else that came in was let's see here. Where is it? A weak enemy with low morale also opens up opportunities. In response to my previous statements, that's coming from Bookham 40. That is definitely true, and I'm not saying that Ukraine couldn't exploit that, because that's what I was saying is. That's when I said I'm not going to say that they can, but or that they can't do it, but I'm also not going to say that they can. I'm not going one way or the other, because Ukraine does surprise us all the time. And the Russians certainly, they're on the back foot, they're on the retreat. They don't have the momentum, and the Ukrainians certainly do. But once again, you can only maintain the momentum if you can keep your troops supplied and equipped. And you can evacuate the wounded and keep the high morale. And cutting yourself off doesn't usually allow for that very easily. It can be very difficult. This is one of the same reasons that making outposts in the middle of nowhere in Vietnam just wasn't a good idea. Because even though you are technically taking control of a hill, you're having good angles and essentially in placing yourself in a position of strategic and tactical importance. The only way to get supplies in is via a helicopter. Helicopters have to land, and they don't usually handle even taking small arms very well, let alone heavy equipment and anti-aircraft fire. So it makes it very difficult to keep well supplied and well maintained. And that goes for Afghanistan too, with a lot of their locations. So Argensing says yes, because KGB is watching the new news for military intelligence. If the Russians thought I was militarily intelligent, I don't know if I would take that as an insult or as a compliment. But about the only thing I could ever see like the Russians actually watching this for is hoping and praying that I disclose information that's pertinent to like the Javelin and the TOW system. That is like actually like important on how it works. and I'm not going to do that. So, yeah. So if you're Russian, see ya. Just watch like half of the subscriber count drop. Anyway, a video was released here of the explosion on Novakhovka Dam. Now, it appears that it did collapse part of the Novakhovka Dam. However, it didn't cause a major breach in it, though a couple of the gates are significantly damaged. There is no major breach in the dam yet that's causing major amounts of flooding. All of the hydroelectric power plant is just completely destroyed. There is no way this thing's generating electricity. The Ukrainians are trying to conduct repairs right now. So this is the blast. And man, it's a blast. And we knew that this was happening. We discussed this months ago that the Russians, when the pressure first came up of the question first came up of, I think the Russians may lose the Kherson Oblast. And this is before the Antonovsky Bridge and Novakhovka were even hit with HIMARS or anything. They had started to mine these things. So we already knew this was coming. You see they already have some of the gates open there. Damn. Can you imagine being anywhere near that? I couldn't. I couldn't imagine being anywhere near that. And this is some Maxar satellite footage of the damage there, of what was done. And what that did is it knocked out this section of the dam. Once again, you can see it's damaged, but it hasn't breached yet. So there isn't major amounts of flooding through this section yet. That doesn't mean that the structural integrity isn't questionable, though. But that is what Ukrainians are currently, the authorities are currently checking on and making sure, ensuring us to get the power back online. Barbara Christina asked, I wonder what they used. Massive amounts of explosives and probably some shape charges. Over in Berislav, the Ukrainian police are some of the first people to bring humanitarian aid into these regions, and what they're doing is they're bringing humanitarian aid. As under the Russian occupation, little to no humanitarian aid was actually supplied to these people, and many basic necessities are essentially impossible to find. So Ukrainian police officers, as they're coming into this region and getting ready to set up, the police stations again and get everything consolidated and start their investigations, they're bringing the supplies in to They can't carry a whole lot in their vehicles, but they're providing this very small amount of life-saving aid until those larger shipments can come in from the multitude of organizations such as the United Nations, the Red Cross, and many, many others as they bring stuff in much larger quantity. So it's not a lot, but it's to tide them over until the larger shipments can get organized and brought in. We see a reunion here. Part of we're taking Kherson. These guys have families in these areas, and this specific Ukrainian soldier, his grandmother lived in this area, and they had a family reunion when he came to her village. So it's a nice little family reunion there. So unfortunately, the reality is setting in, though, and we talked about this last night when we were covering this. Is that last night was the day of, and today too, but last night was really the day, or was really a day of celebration for everything, for the victory and for the liberation. But in the subsequent days and weeks and months, much like they're doing in the Kharkiv Oblast and still doing in the Kiev and Chernihiv Oblasts, we're seeing that we're seeing that the reality is that under occupation, it's hell, and that the victims, 3 individuals who were victims of torture and execution, have been found already here in recently liberated Kharkiv Oblast, or in the recently liberated Kherson Oblast. This is coming from Amin Dezhapar, who is a member of the Ukrainian Verkhovna Rada, which is the Ukrainian parliament. So that is slowly becoming, that stuff is going to come out. Today it's very slow, but over the next few days and weeks, there's going to be a lot more of it. And we have a couple of points here, but this is just the beginning. This is the very beginning. But that is what is expected under Russian occupation. We've seen it already many times, and there's no reason to believe that this region is going to be any different, especially this is one of the longest held regions under the Russians. This is day one, first couple days of the invasion, this territory was seized by them. And so they've been under occupation for some of the longest duration of the war. And so we're going to see some of the most profound effects in this area too. So that is definitely the expectation. But once again, a lot of equipment was left behind by the Russians, as well as probably a lot of guys too. But while the initial jubilee and celebrations for the most part are over, the Ukrainian forces have started combing through the Kherson region pretty thoroughly today. And they're actually going through and they're consolidating all that abandoned Russian equipment and ammunition caches and everything else that they have found, or they have run into, or that they are finding, so that way they can actually turn this stuff around and then be used in the war effort itself against the Russian Federation. And so we got quite a few videos of that here today. See, that guy's smart. He's vaping, not smoking. Unfortunately, a lot of this stuff has copyright music. But you can see, there they are. Tolan. This is a Gaz Tiger, which is a MRAP for the Russians. I mean, they're pulling tanks out. See, new tank. BMP. It's BMP-2. This is stuff that's just been left behind. I mean, that's just, the reality of what's being found here is just a lot of equipment being left behind. And this stuff, single-handedly, is the lead. I mean, Russia is essentially the lead country in giving supplies to the Ukrainian forces. I mean, they give unholy amounts of supplies to Ukrainians because they have abandoned so much equipment. There's so much artillery and so many tanks and armored vehicles. And once again, it brings into question that and I have heard this from a couple of different places, that Ukraine may actually be fielding more armored vehicles now than the Russians. Because the Russians have given them so many armored vehicles and they have taken such heavy losses, the Ukrainians may be fielding more, which is astounding to just think about. Even the possibility, even if that isn't the reality, even just the possibility that that is something that is talked about and that is a question is crazy. You saw the thumbnail for today. This is that photo. Once again, from Amin Zahar. This is a torture chamber that was found in the village of Snihorivka, which is in the Mykolaiv Oblast. This was a village that was liberated 2 days ago on November the 10th. And the Ukrainian authorities did find a detention center and torture chamber here. Which is what today's thumbnail is, because it didn't have anything too crazy in it. So once again, this is the beginning. This will be days and weeks and months of this, possibly years of this, of finding out, just what has happened. And discovering, unfortunately, very terrible situations. And in the city of Kherson itself, celebrations do continue into today, with thousands of people coming out and enjoying the festivities. Yesterday, there was still a little bit of apprehension. I mean, the Russians had just left. There's still some apprehension, but today it's very clear that the Russians are gone, and many, many people coming out and celebrating today. I mean, literally thousands of them. So, lots of people coming out. Very happy to see them still celebrating, still being happy, considering everything that they have had to go through. It's just unbelievable what they have probably had to go through. Incomprehensible to any one of us. And so, with that is everything that is happening inside the country of Ukraine. But we move immediately into the international news. And we actually jump up here into Moscow, where a pro-nuclear rally calling for Moscow to strike Washington, D.C. occurred. Crowds gathered in a pro-nuclear war rally calling Russia to attack the decision-making centers in the United States with Sarmat strategic missiles, nuclear missiles.
По центру принятия решений! По центру принятия решений! Полетные задания в ракету «Сармат». Весь «Сармат» по городам врага. На Вашингтон! На Вашингтон! Враг США! Враг США! Враг США! Мы как мученики попадем в рай! Они просто сдохнут! На Вашингтон! На Вашингтон! На Вашингтон! На Вашингтон! Целься, Иван! Ахмат, запускай! На Вашингтон! На Вашингтон! На Вашингтон! На Вашингтон! Сражайся, Дон! Сармат, главный патрон! На Вашингтон! На Вашингтон! На Вашингтон! На Вашингтон! Мы как мученики попадем в рай! Они просто сдохнут! На Вашингтон! На Вашингтон! На Вашингтон! На Вашингтон! Моя цель, мой шеврон! Наша цель, наш шеврон! На Вашингтон! На Вашингтон! На Вашингтон! На Вашингтон! За Россию! За Россию! За Россию! За Россию! Против садомии! Против садомии! На Вашингтон! На Вашингтон! На Вашингтон! На Вашингтон! Мы как мученики попадем в рай! Они просто сдохнут! На Вашингтон! На Вашингтон! На Вашингтон! На Вашингтон!
That's a pro-nuclear war rally held by the Russians. And I want you to notice some of the what's happening here. So what are they carrying? If you notice, they all have the stripes of St. George, right? The road of St. George. And do you see Russian flags here? No. What do you see? You see Soviet flags. Soviets. And they're worshiping a nuclear missile, by the way. That's somewhat intercontinental ballistic missile. It's a strategic thermonuclear warhead. So, and they're talking about, they know that doing that would kill them. They said we will go to heaven as martyrs. They will simply croak. But it makes you question, right? Like you have to ask. Like obviously, like this is obviously, like this is fanaticism. So let's see, fanaticism. So fanaticism, a quality of being fanatical. So let's see if I can. Fanatical. I'm trying to pull up a definition for you guys. So, fanatical. It's an adjective. It means to be filled with excessive or single-minded zeal. Similar. So, synonyms are zealous, extremist, extreme, militant, dogmatic, sectarian, bigoted, rabid, maniacal, radical, diehard, activist, prejudiced, chauvinistic, intolerant, narrow-minded, single-minded, partisan, blinkered, illiberal, inflexible, uncompromising, or informally swivel-eyed. And the opposite of this is to be moderate or open-minded. That are the antonyms of fanaticism. So that is what it means to be fanatic, to be fanatical. This is fanaticism. It's extremism. It's a type of extremism. You would consider the Islamic State to be fanatical. They are single-minded. They are extreme. They are militant. This is the same thing. That is by definition. And calling for nuclear war, openly protesting and rallying to say we should hit Washington, D.C. with nuclear weapons, is probably not the image you want to broadcast to the world. See, it blows my mind, because the reality is that Russia, while in theory they have more nuclear warheads, the question is, considering we've seen how the rest of their military is, how capable their actual nuclear arm is. It's a very big question of how many of those missiles wouldn't just detonate in their silos should the launch orders be given. Now, that's not to say that many wouldn't fire. It would just be like, how many of them actually would. And it is a question of, and it would mean the end of Russia. Russians have turned this into a war against they started that this was a war against genocide of Russian-speaking people, a war against Nazism, a war against biolaboratories, a war made by the United States, a war against the West, a war against NATO expansionism, and they have now turned it into a religious war, including mobilizing the Russian Orthodox Church. In fact, there's a very famous photo going around. Russian Orthodox Church Z. See if I can find this picture. Z on forehead. So the Russian Orthodox Church was putting Z's on the foreheads of people. Not crosses. No. Z's. 2022. See if I can find this. I wonder if they have it on their website. That would be pretty nice. Publication news. But they were literally taking like the brush and they were putting a Z on people's forehead. That is, they have turned this into a holy war. They've turned this into, this would be what in Islam would be considered jihad, a holy war, and or crusade for Christianity, and that's the crazy part. Is this type of ideology? This is, and someone pointed it out. They said, fanaticism like Nazism. Yes, Nazism is fanatical. It is fanaticism. And that's what we see on the part of the Russians. On the part of Muscovites especially. Muscovites being those from the Moscow area. Basically, white ethnic Russians from Moscow and St. Petersburg. And we see that they are fanatical in belief. They are fanatical, and it's their belief in an authoritarian statehood that is fighting a holy war, a religious holy war against a people that they see as lesser than themselves, and they are calling them things like Nazis and whatever else. Like, that is... Adolf Hitler said that the reason, or Adolf Hitler's justification for the Sudetenland, or for winning the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, is because the Czechoslovakia was oppressing the German-speaking people of the region. Does that sound familiar? It should. Because that's what Russia is doing. In fact, let's see. Hitler on the Sudetenland. Speech. Let's see. Hitler on Czechoslovakia. So, okay, here we go. So I'm going to read this. And I think it's important. So this is a speech made by Adolf Hitler on September the 26th of 1938 regarding Czechoslovakia. And it's been translated by Carlos Whitlock Porter with notes from David L. Hogan. And I want you to tell me if this does not sound familiar. Okay? Blessed are the peacemakers, this is Adolf Hitler. On 22 of February, before the representatives of the Reichstag, for the first time I expressed a fundamental demand of an unalterable kind. The entire nation listened to me at that time, and they understood. One statesman did not share this understanding. He has been removed, and now my promise that I made at that time has been kept. For the second time, I spoke before the Reichsparty Congress about this same demand, and once again the nation heard this demand. Today, I appear before you once again to speak for the first time before the people itself, just as in the time of our great struggle, and you know what that means. For the man, for the world, there should be no more doubt. Now, it's no longer a leader or a man. This time, it's the entire German people is speaking. If I am the speaker for the German people, then I know in this second, the entire nation of millions of people agree with me, word for word, affirm it, and turn into an oath. May the statesmen examine whether that is also the case with them. The question of which concerns us most deeply in the last months and weeks is well known. It's not so much the question of Czechoslovakia. The problem is Mr. Beans. This name unites Benez. This name unites everything that moves millions of people today, that makes them desperate and fills them with fanatical resolution. But why could this question rise to such significance? I want to repeat to you, my national comrades, very briefly, once again, the nature and aims of the German foreign policy. The German foreign policy is, in contrast to many other states, ideologically established and conditioned. The ideology of this new Reich is built upon the maintenance and ensuring the existence of our German people. We have no interest in oppressing other peoples. We want to be happy in our way. The others should be happy in their way. This attitude, required in practice by our ideology, results in a restriction of foreign policy. That means our foreign policy objectives are not unlimited. They are not determined by accident, but rather established in the resolution to serve everything in the German people. To maintain it in this world and ensure its existence was situation today. You know that the slogan self-determination of peoples once filled the German people, as well as others, with the faith of supranational assistance, and allowed to relinquish the application of its own strength to the last end. You must know, you know that this trust is from time was betrayed in the most ignominious manner, the result of the Versailles Treaty. You all know the fearful results of this treaty, and you can all remember how they stole our people's weapons and the way they mistreated this then defenseless people. You know the fearful fate which met us and which persecuted us for a decade and a half. And you know, if Germany today is great, free, and strong again, then it has only its own strength to thank for it. The outside contributed nothing to it. On the contrary, it attempted to blackmail us and oppress us as long as it could until finally the strength grew out of the German people itself to put an end to this unworthy existence and once again to take the path worthy of a free and great nation. We had hardly begun the restoration of German equality than when I suggested a series of agreements which the other countries related most of all to the disarmament as most visible symbol of the relinquishment of revanche. My first proposal was, Germany demands equality under all circumstances, but is prepared to relinquish all further means of defense and weapons, provided that the other nations do the same, i.e. general disarmament. If necessary, right down to the last machine gun. This proposal was not even considered worth discussing. I made a second proposal. Germany is ready to limit its army to 200,000 men on the condition that other states disarm to the same extent. That was rejected too. Although today we are now free and strong, we are not motivated by any hatred of other nations. We don't bear a grudge. We know what happens because we also know that the citizens of the other nations cannot be held responsible for it. Rather, only a small, unscrupulous clique of international profiteers, wheeler dealers, who do not hesitate, if necessary, to allow other entire nations to perish for their villainous interests. We therefore nourish no hatred against the nations around us and have also proven it. The German love of peace is demonstrated by facts. I made yet another proposal. Germany is prepared, provided the other nations agree, to relinquish all heavy weapons, so-called attack weapons, tanks, bombers, even if necessary, all airplanes, as well as heavy and extra heavy artillery. This too was rejected. I went further to now propose an international agreement for all European countries for an army of 300,000 men. This proposal was rejected too. I made more proposals: the restriction of air fleets, the elimination of bombing, absolute prohibition of gas warfare, the protection of all areas not located in the line of battle, elimination at least of heaviest artillery, and the elimination of heaviest tanks. This too was rejected. It was all in vain. So we're going to go down here and skip a bunch of this. This is a really, really long speech. The lie of the Czechoslovakian nation. We'll get to this. On the history of this problem, in 1918, under the slogan of self-determination of peoples, Central Europe was torn to bits and shuffled around a few insane so-called statesmen, without regard to the origin of the peoples, their national desires, or economic necessities. Central Europe was atomized and arbitrarily jigsaw puzzled together again in so-called new states. Czechoslovakia owes its very existence to this procedure. The Czech state began with one single lie. The father of this lie was named Beneš. Mr. Beneš appeared in Versailles and assured everyone first that there was a Czechoslovakian nation. He had to invent this lie to make meager numbers of his own countrymen look bigger and therefore more important, justifying their pretensions. And the Anglo-Saxon statesmen, who have never been particularly well-traveled in geographical or racial national matters, never thought it was necessary to investigate the truth or falsehood of the allegation on the part of Mr. Beneš. Because if they had, they would have immediately discovered that there was no such thing as a Czechoslovakian nation. There are only Czechs and Slovaks, and the Slovaks want nothing to do with the Czechs. So these Czechs, under Mr. Beneš, first of all, started out by annexing Slovakia. And since the state didn't seem viable to justify its existence, they simply grabbed 3.5 million Germans in violation of their right to self-determination and desire for self-determination. Since that wasn't enough, they grabbed over 1 million Magyars and Carpatho-Russians, Ruthians or Diaspora Ukrainians, and finally a few 100,000 Poles in the state which they later called itself Czechoslovakia, in violation of the right of self-determination of people, violation of clear wish and will violated nations. If I am speaking to you today, then I naturally feel the fate of all these oppressed peoples, and I feel the fate of the Slovaks, the Poles, the Hungarians, and the Ukrainians. Of course, I am a spokesman of the fate of my Germans only. And when Mr. Beneš at the time lied the state together and solemnly promised to divide the country up on the Swiss cantonal model, since the few democratic statesmen had pangs of conscience just the same, we all know that Mr. Beneš dissolved the system of cantons and began a terror regime. The Germans attempted to protest against arbitrary violation. Even at that time, they were shot down. Then a war of extermination set in. These years of the peaceful development of Czechoslovakia, nearly 600,000 Germans left the country. This happened for a very simple reason. Otherwise, they would have starved. The whole development of the country since 1913 up to 1938 shows one very clear thing. Mr. Beneš is determined to gradually wipe the German identity. He has succeeded in doing so to a certain extent. He has plunged innumerable people into the utmost of misery. He has succeeded in making millions of people shy and afraid, and under the continual practice of this terror, he has succeeded in depriving these people of a voice. Clarity as to the national tasks of the state became quite clear, and at the same time, no further attempt was made to hide it. The state was intended, if necessary, to be sent into action against Germany. A French minister of aviation, Pierre Cotte, expressed the desire quite soberly. We need this state, he said, but German industry can be most easily bombed to the destruction using its state as a base. The same state use of Bolshevism as its port of entry. It is not Germany who sought contact with Bolshevism, but rather Bolshevism used Czechoslovakia to dig a channel into Central Europe. Now begins the most shameful part of the tale. The state, which is controlled by minority only, forced constituent nationalities to accept political policies which would one day compel them to shoot at men of their own blood in adjacent countries. Mr. Benez demands of the Germans, if I wage war against Germany, I'll make you shoot at Germans. And you don't do that, then you'll be a traitor to Czechoslovakia, and I'll have you shot for that. Whereas Slovakian peoples, for objectives which are of no interest to them, Slovakian people want peace, not adventuring. And it goes on and on and on. So I understand that there's a lot of so this is very long, okay, and I understand that this is quite an offshoot, but the reason why this is important, right? The reason why this is important is you hearing the same ideology, the same rhetoric. Think about that. This is Adolf Hitler in a speech on September the 26th of 1938, 28th of 1938. And you hear it. You can hear it in his words. You can hear what he is saying. And it's the same thing. He says, and the irony is how close that is in reality. And he goes on. He says, in this state run by Mr. Benez, there is a result of a nightmare for all nationalities. I speak only for Germans, and they have the highest mortality rate of all German ethnic groups. Their child poverty rate is the highest. Their unemployment is by far the highest. How long is something like this supposed to last? For 20 years, the Germans in Czechoslovakia, the German people in Germany, have to just sit back and watch, not because they ever accepted the situation, but because Germany was defenseless and could not protect itself against its tormentors in the democratic world. But every time, any place, a traitor is even just imprisoned. Every time a man who shouts abuse at the Reichstag Chancellor just because he doesn't like me personally is taken into custody, there's a commotion in England and an indignation in America. When hundreds of thousands of people are expelled, when tens of thousands of people are thrown into prisons, and when thousands of others are shot down, this doesn't bother our genius brain world Democrats in the least. We have learned a lot in these past years, and we have nothing but the deepest contempt for such people. We see one single great power in Europe with one man at its head who has an understanding of the plight of our people. He is, and I am pleased to say, my good friend Benito Mussolini. We will never forget what has been done in this time, the attitude taken by the Italian people, and And if an hour a comparable misery ever comes to it for Italy, I will stand before the German people and demand that we adopt the same attitude. And then it won't be two states just defending themselves, but rather a bloc. On 20th of February this year, I declare in the Reichstag that there must be a change in the lives of of the 10 million Germans outside our borders. Mr. Benez understood this too, and so he implemented an even more radical oppression, inauguration of even greater terror regime with closures, prohibitions, confiscations, and so on. This started immediately until the end came on 21st of May. And he goes on to talk about going into it. So what is this? Why am I reading this long thing if you're just now joining? So what is Hitler saying in this? Hitler is talking about, in that speech, he's talking about how the German people were all behind him, right? And how the Western leaders just didn't understand, and they didn't care, and they didn't take into consideration his security concerns. I gave proposal after proposal after proposal, is what he says. And he talks about how the German-speaking people in these states that don't really exist, because there is no Czechoslovakian nation. It's arbitrarily just made up. Well, you hear Putin say the same thing about Ukraine. Ukraine exists only to us. These countries in the Baltics exist only because of us. They have no identity. They are Russian. They're created from Russia by Western leaders during the breakup of the Soviet Union. The greatest tragedy of the 20th century, according to Putin. He talks about the destruction of the German people and their identity, and the confiscation and the banning of the language and everything else in Czechoslovakia, and how it, but Germany was building up its military. Germany says that they have no hatred towards these other nations, but only those profiteering, radical, democratic people who only tout self-determination, but don't truly believe in it. You hear the same rhetoric from Putin. The historical similarities are innumerable. Even in some ways in the same timeline. He says in the 20th of February, there. I said that we should help, the 10 million people, throughout the world. And increase suppression of these people. This rhetoric, this ideology has existed before. This wording has existed before. It's Nazism. It's fascism. Fascism was created by Benito Mussolini. For those that don't know. It's called fascismo. It's Italian. So, yes, this is the same rhetoric. This is the same thought process. It is history repeating itself. That is what is happening. That is, except that now everyone has nuclear weapons. But it's fanaticism. It's fanatical. It's Nazism. It's Nazism. It's Nazism with a new face. And there is a purpose behind calling your opponent, calling whoever you don't like a Nazi, or in degrading them or dehumanizing them, because it makes it easier. Look at the propaganda of World War II, and look at the imagery that they come up for the Japanese, that Americans come up for the Japanese, and look how much hatred. Not to say that the Japanese weren't brutal and in their own right with the Bushido Code, but look at the propaganda that's made by the Americans, by American forces on places like Madison Avenue, and the caricatures that are created. That are considered, they make them look subhuman. They make them look animalistic. They make them look brutal, right? They don't ever put it in terms of human beings. And that's something similar you see of all propaganda throughout all warfare. You don't see them as human beings. This is why I don't believe in calling Russians orcs. I don't believe in it. I believe it's incorrect. I don't believe you should do that. I don't think you should dehumanize somebody. Dehumanizing somebody means that you no longer care that they are human. It means you don't think of them as human anymore. You think of them as lesser than. And therefore it is easier to commit atrocities. It is easier to kill them. It is easier to look the other way when bad things happen against them. This is why the rhetoric of them being Nazis is so easy for the Russians. Is why it's so pushed. They're not humans, they're Nazis. They're not Ukrainians, they're Nazis. And they're oppressing Russian people. It's the same rhetoric, it's the same thought process as Adolf Hitler in the 30s, late 30s, early 40s. The exact same thought process, the exact same rhetoric, the exact same mentality. The whole 9 yards. So I'm sorry that was a very long tangent, but I think looking at stuff at a historical point of view and seeing the similarities and puts things into perspective. Now history is not exact, right? Like it's very, but you see this ideology cropping up, and you're seeing things line up in a way that is concerning from someone who knows what happens when situations like this happen, when situations like this occur, that this is, it's not a good situation. And in a historical context, it's never ended well for anybody. So, but yes, anyway, that's fanaticism and essentially Russian Nazism. Russia's version of Nazism. Come over here into Paris, where the WFP director, David Beasley, spoke at the Paris Peace Forum. And so it's the UN World Food Program, and David Beasley runs the whole thing. He's the director there. He spoke very passionately at the UN Peace Forum. He's attempting to garner additional donations, but he's requesting at this point that donations be for flexibility. They allow for flexibility. He doesn't want to create humanitarian dependence on food. He wants them to be able to build sustainable, develop sustainable ways of no longer. As he puts it, he wants to put the World Food Program out of business. He wants the goal of the World Food Program to put itself out of business. Anyway, this is World Food Program Chief David Beasley at the Paris Conference, Paris Peace Forum.
On us when there's $430 trillion of wealth on planet Earth. Shame on us that we're not able to resolve some of the complex conflicts that we have today. 80% of our operations are in war zones. Imagine if we could calm the storm and put that money towards sustainable development for the poorest of the poor. And I'm asking leaders around the world, donors, when you provide funds for us, give us the maximum flexibility so we're not just providing food and creating dependency over and over and over again, because we have sustainable solutions. Shame on us when there's But when we can come in a program like the Sahel and rehabilitate the land. Let me just give you an idea of the heart and the mindset of the poorest of the poor around the world. They don't want handouts. They don't want to leave home. And they tell me, Mr. Beasley, we don't want your support, but we're trying to survive. And when our donors give us the flexibility to rehabilitate the land, guess who rehabilitates the land? It's our beneficiaries. And if you want to learn about the free entrepreneurial spirit, you don't have to necessarily go to Harvard. Go meet an African woman. Oh my gosh. Amazing. Absolutely amazing. Just in the past few years, our beneficiaries have rehabilitated 3.5 million acres of land, built over 81,000 kilometers of feeder roads, 26,000 kilometers of water canals, 380,000 community gardens, 107,000 small ponds and reservoirs to hold water so they can irrigate. And when we come in to these areas with a school meals program, oh my gosh, guess what happens? Migration drops off the chart. Teen pregnancy drops off the chart. Pregnancy and marriage by 12 and 13-year-olds drops off the chart. Recruitment by ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab drops off the chart. It's a lot cheaper to go in advance and do it right than to wait after the fact. That's the World Food Program. Our desire, our hope is to put ourselves out of business.
And so that is his pitch. And today, so that was yesterday. And today he builds on that. And he actually went to Chad and released this video today.
Putting the World Food Program out of business, this is what this is all about. The World Food Program here in Chad, in over 200 villages, supporting 500,000 people, creating resilience and sustainability, not just general food distribution, because that's what we want to end so that people are taking care of themselves. So in this village here in Bull, we have 30 women coming together, produce for their family and their community, taking care of their family, selling it into the marketplace, and that's the World Food Program, working with citizens across Chad to end food dependence and bring food security.
Investing. You know, we talk about donate. We talk about donating, right? We talk about donating to different organizations. That's the whole point of this channel, is to bring awareness to what's happening, put these things into context for you, inform you on what's happening in the world around you. It give you the opportunity to give back to people affected by situations all across the globe, whether that be the war in Ukraine or the war, or war in conflicts, or just disasters or crises ongoing in Africa or in South America or in Southeast Asia or anywhere in the world. That's the point of this channel. And a lot of people don't understand that that it's not just a donation. And for those that may be more of a business mindset, well, how does this help me? We as human beings have a very hard time planning for something in the long future. I mean, we've done things that require multiple generations to complete, but generally speaking, we maintain very short-term goals. And the thing is that investing, think of it as an investment less than a donation. Africa, 7 out of the 10 talk about Africa. Africa requires some of the most large amounts of humanitarian aid efforts in the world. There's quite a few of them that take place here, and this is a lot of emphasis on it on the African continent. It has been for decades. A lot of it is required on dependency, and a lot of it has formed dependency on humanitarian aid in places such as Somalia and Ethiopia. Kenya also falls into that too, as they lie on the Horn of Africa. They require a lot of aid regarding definitely medical resources, not just because of things like Ebola, which originated on that continent and are extremely deadly and are trying to be minimized and kept on that continent by itself, but also in general contraceptions. Places like Djibouti, places like Bangladesh. If you are a business-minded individual, I'm going to tell you why this is a conscientiously good business decision to do this. 7 out of 10 countries in Africa are the most developing countries in the world. They are the most rapidly growing countries in the world economically. 7 out of 10 reside in Africa. This is why countries like China are going to Africa in order to do development programs. This is why the United States, politically and forward policy-wise, is shifting towards Africa for development. This is why a lot of Europe is looking to invest. This is why Russia is looking to invest and why they have made so many trips to Africa. 7 out of 10 countries that are the most developing countries in the world, that is where you want to put your investment in. You want to put it in early, and you want to be able to do it, nice and early, because eventually those are going to return, and it's going to return bigger for you the earlier you do it. So investing in Africa and investing in businesses and in infrastructure and providing jobs and education to the people of Africa is going to help you. Millions of people in Africa do not have the opportunity to go to have good education. Very basic education, but there's very high literacy rates. But that is millions of people that live on that continent. And so if you were to invest in the basic education system there, to allow them to go to school and university, give them that opportunity and the stability to be able to do that without having to go and work out into the fields to where they can complete those programs. How many doctors are there now that could graduate? How many doctors could graduate from that? How many entrepreneurs? How many scientists? How many people? How many inventors to develop the new technology that's going to make you money, that's going to make your job easier? Or if you believe, you're worried about climate change, investing in Africa to develop them in a way that keeps them, providing the resources, building on the resources that allow them to develop as a nation without becoming dependent on fossil fuels or coals or other things or other materials that cause air pollution in a massive quantity. One of the reasons why regions of the world are actually, especially like Africa and China, is because are the leading producers of carbon emissions in the planet. The reason why is because these are developing countries, and the main argument for them to not slow down their rate of usage of carbon fuels, right, of fossil fuels and carbon emissions, and not reduce carbon emissions, is because the rest of the world, they see it as a way of minimizing their economic growth capability, because they aren't able to develop. That's how you develop, is developing your manufacturing and your industrial base and your capabilities and building your economy in that way. The rest of the world did it before we knew what global warming was, what climate change was. And now these countries think it's unfair that they are being limited by those countries that already had oppressed them. So invest and show them clean ways. Invest technology in Africa for them to develop their economy, to develop their manufacturing process in cleaner ways, to where they're still developing and they're causing less of a harmful impact on the environment, and that will slow climate change. And that will not affect you, and then the effects will be lessened on you. Look at the world today. Look at the world over the past year. Major natural disasters, multiple hurricanes that hit on the east coast of the United States. In Europe, if you are from Europe, many of the rivers in Europe ran dry. If you're from the Middle East, you would know the Tigris and Euphrates were at their lowest points in decades, and the fact is that the Persian Gulf was actually flowing back into Iraq and poisoning the water with salt water. Worst drought in 40 years is ongoing in Ethiopia, Somalia, and Africa, and on the Horn of Africa. Multiple super typhoons hit Southeast Asia. And a global food crisis that has caused everyone to spend more money for food, including you and myself. To go to the grocery, it's almost doubled in price for many places. investment on sustainable, for sustainable things, for development in sustainable ways, is an investment not just in the people and improving the people's lives there, but is an investment in yourself. Because it's very possible that if you invest in the healthcare, if you invest in the education and medical education in Africa and in right now, that by the time you're old and you require significant amounts of medical care, right? Because your body, you're aging, your body requires, to then some of the technology that will be used to save your life and to extend your life and allow you to live life more comfortably at an older age could be easily developed by one of the millions of people that currently don't have that opportunity in Africa. There's millions of people who can invent something. There's millions of people who can develop things that are rich in their own culture. And that's just Africa. That's not talking about the Middle East. That's not talking about the rest of the world. This is why going through and following through, it's not just a donation to end a certain thing. Not just, we're not talking about helping people because a truck comes out and gives them some food, though that is part of it. I 100% agree with David Beasley's mission. 100% have agreed. I have agreed with that for a very, very long time now. Sustainable development instead of creating dependency is how you help people throughout the world. If there was good economic opportunity and there was good education, if there was good education, solid public education, and there's opportunity inside of South America in a widespread level, there's economic opportunity, if there's sustainable development in South and Central America, do you think the cartels would be nearly as powerful as they are now? No. Would Boko Haram and the Islamic State in Africa be so powerful if people had other opportunities in their life? Probably not. Because they'd be focused on other things instead of a radical idealism. Same thing with the Middle East. Same thing with anywhere else in the world. Look at the pullout from Afghanistan. How many hundreds of thousands of people fled or attempted to flee and went to the Kabul International Airport? Because a lot of people, even though there were a lot of people, fundamental extremists, that did not like what the United States was doing, there's a lot of people who did. Because they saw the opportunity and they knew that opportunity, that safety, and those freedoms were going away. Look at the people in Iran. What happens when they aren't allowed those opportunities? They no longer want that government. So yes, John Scott puts it very simply. Give a man a fish, he'll eat for a day. Teach a man a fish, he'll eat for a lifetime, kind of thing. So, but it is an investment for those that are business minded. It's an investment for you, and an investment that will see returns. Over here in Lisbon, Portugal, climate protesters are calling for the resignation of a minister. Hundreds of protesters went to the protests in Lisbon on Saturday. They stormed the building where Portugal's economy minister, Antonio Costa e Silva, a former oil executive, was speaking to resign. Police officers dragged the protesters out of the building. The minister has reportedly left the building through the back door. And this is coming from Reuters. Is it just me, or are climate protesters becoming extreme? It's okay. Like, I want to save the environment too, because terrible things are happening. But I also aren't go. I'm also not going to like storm, like break into a building, and you know have to be kicked out by police. I'm also not going to glue myself to a fossil. Now, thousands are protested against corruption here. This is in Albania. Tens of thousands gathered and protested in front of the office of the Prime Minister Edi Rama against corruption, rising poverty, and the growing number of people leaving the country. Candles were lit in memory of 2 men who reportedly died while during police custody. After demonstrating peacefully for around 3 hours, protesters broke into the police cordon around the government building and threw red and black paint. Police arrested 1 protester. For more information, once again, you can go and check out Reuters. Down here in Lebanon, there's an update regarding a cholera outbreak. Since the first case was confirmed on the 5th of October, a total of 3,253 suspected cholera cases, 521 lab-confirmed cases, have been reported, along with 18 associated deaths as of November the 11th. About 45% of suspected and confirmed cases are less than 15 years of age. Across the country, 62 beds are currently occupied for cholera treatment. The majority of cases continue to predominantly be reported from Akkar and the northern parts of Lebanon. Over here in Japan, Japan is providing Somalia with $14 million USD for the food crisis. The government of Japan decided to provide emergency grant aid of $14 million USD to the Federal Republic of Somalia in response to the serious food crisis on November the 11th. This would allow for the implementation of humanitarian assistance activities to the United Nations World Food Program, or WFP, so that Ukrainian wheat donated by the Ukrainian government will be transported to Somalia and distributed to populations in need of food assistance. We do get that from the official Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan in their official statement. Jump down into Africa, coming out of Nairobi here in Kenya, an agreement released from second stage of the peace talks between Ethiopia, the Ethiopian government, and the Tigray rebels, following their signature. Regarding their signature of the agreement for the lasting peace in Pretoria, South Africa on November the 2nd, Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia and the Tigray People's Liberation Front released an agreement regarding implementation of certain permanent cessation of hostilities on November the 12th of 2022. Both parties agreed to stop all forms of military engagement, the disarmament of Tigray armed combatants, and withdrawal of foreign forces from sovereign territory of Ethiopia and Tigray region, protection of civilians, and delivery of humanitarian aid. Very, very good to see. We can see the agreement here. Fantastic to see. The AU made a statement, or the African Union also made a statement regarding this. And the FDRE also made a statement. Coming out of Uganda, we have an update on the Ebola outbreak. As of November the 10th, at least 54 cumulative deaths and 65 cumulative recoveries since September the 20th, when authorities declared an outbreak of Ebola. 18 were admitted. There were 1 new case over the last 24-hour period. Thousands contacts are being followed up. Most of the cases were identified and diagnosed after 5 days of symptoms, giving infected people time to spread the virus. There's a high risk of increasing the death toll. WHO, World Health Organization, has handed over 9,000 info posters and 1,000 thermometers to Kampala city authorities to raise awareness about the Ebola outbreak and in support of strengthened surveillance activities in Uganda. And finally, up here in Sudan, providers called the government to scale up response to the dengue fever outbreak. The Central Committee of Sudan Doctors, or CCSD, and protest groups called on the federal government to declare the area of Al Obeid, capital of North Kordofan, a disaster area on November 10th due to the outbreak of dengue fever. They explained that hospitals were overcrowded with patients. The committee demanded more logistical and technical resources be transferred to Al Obeid and asked that the government to provide mosquito nets and distribute them free of charge to all the people in the city. Coming from one of the hospitals there. If you want more information on that, you can go and check it out at relief.web or reliefweb.international. Coming over to Port-au-Prince here in Haiti, the seeds of peace have begun. About 1,500 young people from some of the most vulnerable and violent gang-controlled neighborhoods of the Haitian capital, Port-au-Prince, got together in the Semons La Paix, or Seeds of Peace, project event supported by the United Nations Peace Building Fund. They have been talking about the power of getting together and share experiences and engaging in sports and entrepreneurial activities. Coming from the United Nations. So very happy to see that. Haiti's pretty much controlled at this point by violent gangs. And so it's very happy to see that younger individuals are becoming more open to kind of stopping that. Up here in New York, Global Fertilizer Challenge raised $135 million USD. The United States, European Commission, Norway, Germany, and the Netherlands announced a total of $135 million in new funding for fertilizer efficiency and soil health programs to combat fertilizer shortages and food insecurity. This announcement exceeded President Biden's global fertilizer challenge goal set at the June 17th Major Economies Forum to raise $100 million by COP27 to help low and middle income countries address the global fertilizer shortages. The $109 million in the new public funding, including $25 million from the United States, will be used to expand fertilizer and soil health programs in sub-Saharan Africa and key middle income countries outside the continent. If you want more information on that, then you can go and you can check it out at reliefweb.international. And as people brought up several hours ago, happening about 1 p.m. local time, this would have been about 2 p.m. Eastern time, so roughly about 5 to 6 hours ago. The FAA said a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress and a Bell P-63 King Cobra collided and crashed about 1:20 p.m. local time in Dallas, Texas at the Dallas Executive Airport. Information regarding casualties was not immediately available when we were getting this information. This was during the Wings Over Dallas Air Show. So the B-17 and the P-63 are both aircraft from World War II. Very few of them are still around. But it is believed, I believe at this point, that neither of the air crews survived.
Oh no! Oh no! Oh
What? No!
Are on their way. Please stay off your cell phones. We want to make sure that the emergency personnel have all those channels open for critical communications.
No.
children, if you wish to turn them away from the flight line.
Dios mío! Oh, Dios mío!
So, some people are like, did the pilot do this on purpose? So, something I've seen very well pointed out, and it is very true, is that the P-63 King Cobra has a very large instrument panel into the front. It has a very large radial engine in the front of the aircraft. And so the instrument panel is very difficult, and it does not have very good lines of sight. It's one of the reasons why the P-63 Cobra, while very prevalent during World War II, was not one of the most popular aircraft used, because it had very poor lines of sight, and it was better in other aircraft that they had were much more efficient as fighter aircraft and patrol aircraft. So that's one of the reasons the P-51 Mustang being primarily used by Allied Air Forces, as well as for naval aviators. You also had things like the F-4F Wildcat and the F-6F Hellcat and the Vought F-4U Corsair. So that were just superior aircraft and had better visual capabilities. So they believe that that was very possible that the pilot of the P-63 King Cobra just simply, despite the B-17 being a rather large aircraft, did not have very good visuals because of the aircraft's instrument panel obscured the B-17 until it was too late. And the B-17 likely did not see the P-63 coming in until it was too late. Obviously separated the tail from the main body of the fuselage of the B-17. The P-63 essentially was annihilated upon impact with the much larger B-17. And there was no real time for anyone to bail out, so that it would appear that both crews, from our understanding, were actually killed in the crash. So that is what's happening there in Dallas. And with that is actually all of the news for the day. So we will hopefully have an update on Monday regarding what happens with the rest of the crash there, and more updates regarding everything else ongoing throughout the world. In the meantime, please be sure to check out all the different organizations in the description. That is really what we're here for. And to please give your support to them as much as you can. Now, if you can't give a lot to those organizations, give it a little. And if you can't give anything at all, give us a like, subscribe, let your friends know about us, share us in your communities, because the more people that come here, the more of an impact that we will have as an organization, or as a news team, in being able to help people throughout the world affected by a lot of the crises ongoing. And with that, I hope that that you, your family, and your friends are safe. And if not, I hope you find that safety and security in the very near future. And we will hopefully see you back on Monday night at 10 p.m. Eastern Time, 9 p.m. Central. And I will talk to you guys later. Bye now.
Going home, Russian soldiers, going home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. І стріляти в головах, і чутно кличуть, ідіть нахуй. Тут працює ЗСУ і ТРО. Нам не треба ні конфлікту, ні війни. Та ми готові всіх вас звать до сатани. Тисячі вже полягло, і все більше шверхуйло. То для них нема нічого, крім труни. Going home, Russian soldiers, going home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. І стріляти в головах, і чутно кличуть, ідіть нахуй. Тут працює ЗСУ і ТРО. Вызволять пришел, братишка, ну привет. На моей земле тебе один ответ. Нашим людям с кирпичом, даже танки и бачок. Вам не взять нас и за 100 000 лет. Going home, Russian soldiers, going home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. І стріляти в головах, і чутно кличуть, ідіть нахуй. Тут працює ЗСУ і ТРО.
Mr. Putin, on behalf of all our guys, no one's scared of your nuclear device. You can take your number 11, shove it up your wrinkled bum. I will come and help you fit it in your skull.
Бістрия до волновахи, чутно клич, ідіть нахуй, тут працює ЗСУ і ТРО. Going home, Russian soldiers, going home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. Бістрия до волновахи, чутно клич, ідіть нахуй, тут працює ЗСУ і ТРО. Going home, Russian soldiers, going home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. Бістрия до волновахи, чутно клич, ідіть нахуй, тут працює ЗСУ і ТРО. Ідіть нахуй.